Thank you very much for this kind startup and presentation. And I'm really glad to be here and presenting for this digital futures context. And I'm going to talk about digital tools for ecological assessment of land cover changes. And this is part of a digital futures project called Earth Observation, Big Data and Artificial Intelligence for Global Environmental Change Monitoring. And we're doing the part that is dealing with the ecological assessment of these changes. And this here principal investigator is Yifang Ban, and the co-PIs are listed here. But we in this study is actually me and Lilian Pang, who is also here at the seminar. So then today we're going to talk about, first we need a little outlook for what are those global changes that we are dealing with, and some problems and needs that we have. And then the impact on forest ecosystems is where we will get into. And also the digital tools then for impact prediction. So a look at the global change. The global changes that we are trying to address and follow the changes and look at, they are coupled between climate change, biodiversity loss and land use change. And very much related to the goals, the sustainable development goals in this line, like climate action, life on land, but also sustainable cities and communities. And one of the, of course, well-known changes is about temperature and climate change. So this is just an illustration of that it is one of the big changes, and that we have some severe consequences of that. And then for biodiversity loss, it is maybe not as known, but now it's coming more and more in the consciousness of people that we have a really, really bad situation here with the biodiversity decline. And we have recent studies that have looked at what's going to happen with business as usual. And if we only do conservation efforts, that is the yellow part here, but also that if we have to actually move into more sustainable production and consumption patterns in order to actually make a change here. And some of them are really related to the land use and land use changes and our intensified land use. So these things work together, unfortunately, to really threaten biodiversity. And then if we look at biodiversity and then look at the main threats here, we have direct exploitation is highest up here, but not much less is the habitat degradation and change and the habitat loss. And the difference between these is that the habitat loss, then we don't expect any regrowth at all. You kind of really remove completely the habitat. But the habitat degradation can be more or less severe, and there is no really strict line between them. And this is also huge problems here. And then just to put things straight in front of us, the climate change itself right now is not on the top list, but it's really rapidly increasing, and ecosystems are changing, so that this figure is changing as we speak. And one of the things when it comes to forest, for instance, is the forestry. And this is from British Columbia in Canada, where just as an example of this heavy land use change that is happening. And it really is affecting huge areas nowadays. And when we look at our ecological assessment, it is addressing biodiversity and both related to climate change and land use change. So we are looking at wildfires, for instance, and together with intensified land use as cumulative effects, and land conversion also. And this leads to something that is called habitat loss and degradation. That is how you can kind of put it together in one expression. And then another thing, just before we go further, we need to decide on what is biodiversity. It's a very broad concept. So it is the variety of life on Earth and variability among organisms, but also within organisms and between species and of ecosystems. And that means that it's complicated. So this just want to tell that many times you think, oh, it's just number of species, but it's also ecosystems and landscapes and the structure. Do we still have equal amount of each species and their populations, or are they just one start to dominate and we have lost something? And also functions like demographic processes. Is the migration still going on? Is it possible to move in the landscape? And it can be hydrological processes and so on. So it is complicated and hard to catch, and yet we have to do it. And this is a main problem for biodiversity today, habitat loss and fragmentation, and it is caused by wildfires, intensified land use and land conversion. So let's just look a little at habitat loss and fragmentation. To the right is an illustration of the original habitat and how it gets both, it's shrinking and it's also getting more patchy. So it can really affect population dynamics and probability of extinction, and increases the isolation of patches. They can be far away now. So more resources is spent on movements, and the patch size is also decreasing. So, and you lose resources in the smaller patches. So you have less resources for growth and fecundity, and risk for local extinctions and then regional extinction. And you have a loss of total habitat area. And this is a little more like a geometric figure here. To the right is 100% habitat in the landscape, and then it's getting more and more fragmented. And here to the left is no habitat. And what's happening here, it's a geometrical phenomenon, is that when you lose here, you get rapidly increase in the distance between patches. And this is what's happening a lot now. And so here you can see the amount of suitable habitat in the landscape, and here is the habitat patches, the single patches, are they used or not? And here is when you have very little percentage of habitat, usually it gets so scattered that many patches are not used. So that means that there is a rapid decline when you start losing habitat. So it kind of goes down much quicker than you thought. And to the right is an example from forest in Sweden, in northern Sweden. Here's the Baltic Sea. And the loss of really old forest has been continuing. So we are really in after heavy logging and so on, this situation is that this valuable habitat is really have declined a lot. And then you could notice these were rather old references, but here is the most recent discussion about this ongoing. And here you can see that there's also a time delay. So in some species, what's happening now is immediately showing in what's happening in these patches, but here maybe after 6 years or 20 years, then you can see the effect of this. So that means that we have still a extinction guilt when we have fragmented the habitat. So this is an ongoing, very important discussion. And looking at the forest, the global impact on forest, there is 30% of the global land area is forest. And there's both loss and gain in different areas, even if there is a net loss of forest. And here we can see different areas. Brazil is really bad net loss. And some areas are close to neutral, but now we're talking about all forest and not particularly old forest. And here is reforestation programs doing this. So it is both loss and gain, but this is the total forest cover. But if we look at the drivers of the tree cover loss we have had, then we have actually a huge staple here of wildfire and forestry and shifting agriculture. And this is more like when you convert the forest to grazing and so on. So this is huge tree cover loss. And the gains are usually planted forest, but sometimes also reforestation, more natural. And then we are looking at a really important habitat here for biodiversity, and like you can call it primary forest, and then it's about 1/4 of the total area, and there the global loss is high. So that when you talk about here forestry, maybe you replant it, but it's not like having the primary forest. And this is very critical habitat for biodiversity and also for carbon storage. And if we talk about wildfires, historically and global, it is a natural disturbance of some forest ecosystems, and humans have been both suppressing and lighting fires on purpose or not. With climate change, there is a slight decrease actually in the total wildfires, depending on much quicker response from humans and so, but the frequency and size and severity in some regions is really increasing, really making a big change. And then you have the main impacts, loss of human lives and property, emissions of carbon dioxides, soil erosion and pollution, and habitat loss. And this is an example from British Columbia. And if we look in Sweden, then we have a total forest area of 69% of the land area. And here we are looking into the fire season 2018, and then we have about 228 square kilometers of fires spread out like this. So this is a very unique for Swedish condition to have this much fires, and we did also have habitat loss of forest core areas, which are near primary forest. And so these are the fires, and one of them being 43 square kilometers, which is really huge. And these are different regions affected. So we have in the boreal zones, northern, middle, and southern boreal zones, there's a huge fire area. And the continuity forest is one way of finding near primary forest, but the core areas are even better mapped, and there's also significant amounts of those core areas being burnt. So this is something that we want to investigate. And if we look at protected areas, this is areas protected for outdoor recreation, biodiversity, watercourses, and watersheds. But there's also some new protected areas because some of the ecosystems, the drier forest, has a history of being burnt, and then there are actually species adapted to that. So it's complicated. And if we then go to British Columbia for comparison, here we have a huge tree cover loss from logging and wildfire. in the boreal and temperate forest, here's really an area with increasing size and frequency and severity of wildfires. And there is, of course, both for logging and wildfire, some regrowth going on, but that depends on the time step, the size, and the severity of the fire, and so on. So we are asking ourselves about, is this temporary or permanent habitat loss? And will we have a time step where we don't have any habitat for many species? And here's the fires 2017 and 2018. And you can see they are huge. And here's some statistics. It's about tenfold or more from the most severe in Sweden, as I just showed you. So the 2017, 2018 was really huge fires here. And they were in the boreal forest, but also in the temperate forest that is not by the Atlantic, because this one is much more moist, but this one is dry. So we have really, really huge fires here. And it was a lot in protected areas, as you can see. Huge protected areas were really burnt, severely burnt, and the old growth forest outside the protected areas. So it's really affecting. But then we need to find out more about how to really assess this from an ecological point of view. So we are looking around the digital tools for ecological assessment. And so we want to predict the ecological impacts of the fires and the cumulative impacts with other disturbances like logging and looking at each time step, what's happening. So we want to address habitat loss and fragmentation and the significance of impacts. And then we want to look at what we have around us about the models. So what can be models? What can be modeled? Well, species can be modeled, their occurrences, presence, absence data if you have. What you do have often is just presence data. And abundance if you have, or whole communities can be modeled if you have data. And some model really detailed extinction in each patch, colonization, dispersal, but also the suitable habitat as it is. And so what do we want to predict? We can try to predict the patterns in the landscape, or we can try to predict the processes that are detailed. So it goes from biodiversity hotspots up to communities, number of species, species occurrences, colonization and extinction, up to individual life history. So all these you have models to do, digital tools. And here is about the parameter estimation. So if you go to the left in this figure, it's empirical in the sense that what you model, you have a lot of data. You need a lot of data. You need to know where's the species. I need to know, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. It's a huge demand of data. But to the right is more like, you know, someone else did that, and you just gather the literature, or you interview and you just parameterize your model out of expert knowledge. And then what are the results of the prediction? Many models model suitable habitat. Other a little more detailed, like one is going for population viability, which is a lot of parameters needed, or just dispersal. Can they move and more? It's just and then if you look at the predictive models, how they work. Here is when you just build directly on empirical data, you can find statistical habitat suitability models or machine learning habitat suitability models. While here are some expert models of different kinds, and here you could call them metapopulation models. To assess the whole population viability. There's more. And then we just put a few a few of the models that exist and are used a lot and have big communities around them, just to make an overview of what you can get. But this one, there is much more out there. It's just an example of what digital tools you have and what exist. We also work with network-based models. Oh, I think I should. We have two sorts of models: network-based models and machine learning models to talk about today. I want to start with the machine learning models. So machine learning and biodiversity, it's really exploding. So the vision of machine learning models, it's a very recent publication in Nature about it, by the way, is to capitalize on large data sets generated by modern sensors. So there's great hope for this here. The mission is to provide tools for rapid assessment of wildlife diversity, population dynamics at large scale and high spatiotemporal resolution. And that's kind of in line with what we want. So we want to have a look here what we can do. And what are they modeling? This is from this review. Population densities, single species recognition is an important evolution and occurrence, of course. Species movements, but also individuals of species you can see. And a lot of this explained by habitat characteristics, climate variables, disturbances, but some are just recognizing the species, of course. But if you want to take it further and useful for assessment, then you need to know, like, where's the species, even in where you didn't investigate it. You want to have a good prediction of that. And when you talk about the new data capture, one important is, of course, high resolution remote sensing. And then we can find habitat or certain large species. But also we have camera traps, citizens cameras, acoustic sensors on animal tracking tags. But there's still data concerns. The complexity of biodiversity that I started with talking about is a problem still, because what are you capturing? Are you capturing the representative thing? But of course, field work is systematic, but very slow in this. And then one thing is opportunistic data collection. One very common now is citizen science, where people use their cameras or just the observations and put it together. And that needs usually some kind of verification, and that verification is slow. But here also machine learning can help in actually checking and letting the expert only check the difficult data. But we still have to think about what can be captured by these new fantastic sensors and what do we need. Here's just some example from this paper, and here's the community science that I talked about. And the data capture are just some examples. When they have loggers on animals, they get a lot of new, this is about whales, of course, and how they move around different individuals, and you learn a lot from that. And this is acoustic sensors, and the blue is when the different bird species are singing, and then they have compared with skilled ornithologists. So you can see that probably neither one of them is perfect. So you have to understand that just because it's a digital systematic data sampling of acoustic signals, it doesn't have to be properly capturing everything, because some birds are more silent and it's easier to see than hear, and so on. So all of this has some good and bad. You have to learn a little about that to be able to use it. And yeah, citizen science to the left is just an illustration of people are working with this. To the right is one of the is the Artdatabanken, the Swedish species observation system, and here they do a lot of data collection. It's really popular, and many people are working, putting in their observations, and then they are reviewing them, and they have there are difficulties in how to actually use the data. Can we trust it? There is only presence data also and no absence data. So this is work going on. They have some especially skilled observers that if they don't observe something, then they can actually trust that it's an absence data, because otherwise you only get presence data. This is also gets much better if you have absence data. And then this is a similar thing, Swedish LifeWatch with an analysis portal, so you can for yourself use the observations and use geographic data on climate, vegetation, and so on to link and to create your own habitat suitability maps and so on. And there's another one for global biodiversity information facility. So there's a lot going on. And this is just looking at the global biodiversity information facility. And behind it is also, if you want, an machine learning software that takes the data and relates this according to your instructions to different predictors like habitat, climate, precipitation, and so on, and then try to make a habitat suitability map. So this one has been around for a long time, actually. It's an early example. Now, that was what's going on one line of research. It's about how to use the empirical models and machine learning, and that's really new. But there's another line of research that is also very useful, and that is network-based models and biodiversity. And they also address, maybe even more explicit, habitat loss and fragmentation. And the habitat patches are or are not seen as part of habitat networks. So it builds on graph theory. And you could call them expert models because you have to build it on what you know about species, on their traits, so to speak. And traits can be, what is the habitat? How much do you need? Is there a movement capacity somehow? And then you get the patches, and you have the sizes, and then you have the accessibility between them. Is it far? Is it something in between here that stops the movement? And here is too far, so it's not part of the network. So you have here you have this network. So this is in the basic, really basic part of it. But you can do a lot with indicators around these networks. And this is just one way of explaining the traits in simple way, that you can have different habitat area requirements, movement capacity, and you can usually place species in this diagram. And yeah, it's not always they are fantastic dispersers just because they can fly. So it's really characteristic things that you need to know if you want to do it, network analysis. But you can also try to have more traits like habitat specialist, what's the reproduction rate, what's the range, and this is an effort of using huge amount of studies and data on different species and to cluster them so that you can see that around certain habitat you have a species that has difficulties with dispersal and so on. So this can be a way of getting representative parameters for your model. And if we want to continue on that, we can try to put them in a similar diagram and have a look at what are the traits, what are the movement distance, and so on. And in a way, when you have such a cluster, you could call them virtual species, and that's just an expression to tell that we're not really exactly just modeling species, but trying to capture characteristics that make them vulnerable but are realistic. There are species out there that have these traits. And we want to find their habitat networks and also in the end make some kind of assessment of risk for the population. So different traits here will give different networks and different future prospects too. So this is what it can look like. This is called matrix green, but there are others too. And this is a network. So you can, in the bottom you have the habitat, but if you want, you can represent it just with a node. And the size of the node is shown here, but and then how, if it's linked or not linked, and if this is a very important strategic patch between north and south, then you can get that indicator and so on. So you can make a lot of things that can tell you if it's important for the network if you lose these patches, or if you add, you can also add patches in this with some kind of restoration. So if we just take all that I said now and go back to the forest fires in Sweden, then, as you remember, there was about 228 square kilometers of forest burned, and it's not much of the total forest in Sweden. So that is one thing. The largest fire, though, was very, very big, and then I just want to remind that we had an even more huge fire a few years earlier. So we tried to look at this and find out still, because all species are not present in whole Sweden. So we tried to find 4 fire hotspots, and they're a similar size, and the size is as big as a small county of Sweden. A small county. So it's kind of a regional assessment, but we just wanted to look at the fire hotspots. And we also need to look at cumulative impacts. We can't just look at one. So if we want to look at habitat loss and fragmentation, we have to also add forestry to the equations. So for the 4 different squares, the fires themselves were actually big here in the northern, but huge in this number 2, and small here and here. So it is very different between them. So the illustration is a little exaggerated just to be visible. And then we looked at the habitat networks in the same style as I showed you. And if you look at the total core area, now remember, they're all 10,000 square kilometers. And this is the size of the core area, which is the most valuable forest here. And it's here it's actually big, 1/10. But the connected, the gray here is the connected core area in the same region. And that one is much less, and that's because some fragments are too scattered. So here we have species moving from 200 meters, which is very, very small, up to 5,000 meters, which is kind of a good capacity of movement. And they still don't come out. There's still a lot of unused patches. If you remember in the beginning when I talked about it, it's still a lot of patches that are not part of the network. They're isolated. And that makes it the prospect of surviving worse or less. And then we find this area 2, which one was severely burnt. And here you can see that the fire really made a change from the left one to the here. But then we added the clear cuts on top of it, and that one wasn't significant. So, but this change, it's not so much change in percentage, but in actual size, it's between 2 and 8 square kilometers of habitat. That's a lot. So that's a lot. It's really, so that one is really significant. While down here you have another problem, not that the fires were so significantly affecting, but they are very vulnerable. It's so small percentage of the total area and so scattered that if it was more unlucky, then it would be really vulnerable, and you can really have local and regional extinctions. Local, you can see easily, but if you have enough local extinctions, you get regional extinctions, you get problems. And here we just have exactly the same story, but with a different type of forest. So there's a lot of spruce here in the northern part, and then comes pine. Here is spruce and pine was the one that really was affected by the burnt area. Here, I'm sorry, the color shifted a little, but here we have a smaller area again of the different tree species, and here's the one with the southern broadleaves. And they were, the most significant things here is that here we have this habitat loss of the habitat networks that will really be problematic. But here we also have some low habitat amount, and some final felling was traced, and it shouldn't be in the core area. Some are protected, some are just certified, but they shouldn't cut them actually. But it seems like there is some cutting going on. So in sum, I want to come down to just this slide, that we have now been looking at two types of models that are possible ways forward. And one is expert models, and then we have chosen the network-based models because they really address much more the habitat loss and fragmentation. And it's really interesting if we can find more information about species traits, and we are looking at the Swedish Red List and their judgments to see how many species that with low population density are part of different parts of Sweden and so on, and that they are critically linked to these habitats. And then so that what we call empirical models, there are great opportunities for machine learning in this context and in this project and in the digital futures context. So, but here we still find it a little difficult on which empirical data to use. I mean, we want to be representative of the habitat changes, so it is a little difficult to actually just jump on to this. But yeah, and there are some problems with the opportunistic data where we have a lot of data, and yeah, so it's not so systematic. But let's see what we can do. Yep. So that's all I had for now. Thanks for listening, and yeah, I welcome questions.